Army mateys, today we'll be talking about the thing that every pirate needs, and that is treasure. But what if that treasure is not only accursed, but also treasure in space? Well, I guess we'd better find out, shall we? Arr! Welcome back everybody to Pirate Winter, and this is the almost last time we'll do this, where we talk about a pirate book, and today we'll be talking about Shadow Captain, Book 2 in the Revenger series by Alastair Reynolds, published in 2018. And if you have not read the first part, Revenger, or watched the video, you should probably do that. And, well, then we'll do your usual thing. I'll tell you about the book in quick, why you should read it, and then we'll talk about details and how it fits into the larger pirate sphere. And before we go further, I want to bring out a toast to one of my Patreon backers, in this case, Momo. This one's for you. Cheers, my friend. If you too want one of those personalized cheers, well, you can become a channel member or join the Patreon and you will get one of those callouts whenever I remember to do one. Now, let's talk about Shadow Captain. Shadow Captain, as I said, is the follow-up to Revenger and the middle one in the Revenger trilogy by Alastair Reynolds. So it follows relatively shortly after the events of Revenger, with the Ness sisters now reunited on board of a boat, of a ship that they have retitled, renamed into Revenger. Yeah, I know, surprising. And now they need to come to terms with what happens now that you have taken over a famous pirate ship, and everyone may just think that you may be pirates. And, you know, also trying to restock their boat and generally find out what to do with their lives. Turns out there are people who want to get rid of Bousa Senen and don't exactly care who runs that ship. And from there on, one thing after the other is getting into, well, in the way of the Ness sisters and their compatriots, and they are also still trying to solve the problems or the riddles that Bousa Senen left them at the end of Revenger, which means, of course, questions about where the coins come from and, well, what is it with all these occupations and why do some of them work and some of them don't? And, yeah, that's mostly what you get in this book. It's the middle part of a trilogy, so while there is some pretty big revelations near the end, it does sort of rely heavily on stuff that has been set up before, while also building sort of like to a big finale in the third book, Bone Silence, which we will talk about very, very soon. So yeah, if you read the first one and you enjoyed it, you should read this one, because it's good, it's really good, and the third one is obviously also good. So let's talk about some details and spoilers and all of that. From here on out, there will be spoilers, so beware. Alright. And one thing that I talked about last time is, of course, how Alastair Reynolds took a lot of, like, the tropes of the pirate story, the things that make pirate stories feel like pirate stories, and even, you know, pirate histories, and stripped them of their historical context and put them into space to have all the fun without all the historical baggage. And that, I think, was a clever move. And we'll talk about some of these elements here as well. See, one thing that has always been part of the whole pirate thing, both pirate history and, of course, pirate stories, is how easily someone is slipping from being a merchantman to being a privateer to being a pirate to back being a loyal subject of whoever flag he's or she is sailing under, and so forth. And, you know, that is certainly happening here as well, with, you know, Fira Ness in particular, obviously trying to capture a pirate ship, and now that she's taken over that pirate ship together with, you know, her sister Adrana, and so forth, they are maybe slowly turning pirate. A historical example for that would be, of course, Captain William Kidd, who set out to, you know, find pirates, hunt down pirates, and, yeah, we all know how that one turned out, don't we? It ended on execution dock, as you may be aware of. So, those historical historical examples are obviously there, but they also touch upon something that a lot of pirate stories have to reckon with, because being a pirate is obviously incredibly romanticized in today's media, and everyone wants to be the pirates, while also, you know, pirates being bad, right? They rob other people, they take stuff, they murder, and all of those things. We kind of, at the back of our heads, kind of know that pirates are not exactly the good guys, right? So one thing that every pirate story has to tackle is, like, how can our heroes be the heroes and still work together with pirates, and from there on, you know, skirt that line between being maybe, adventurers, still the good guys while committing crimes, basically. And there's different ways of dealing with that. Sometimes it's people being captured and having no choice, which is, once again, something that has historically happened. It's the way that Te solves the problem at the beginning, at least, with Jean-Jean d'Arnac at the beginning of On Stranger Tides being, forced to join the pirates. And up to a point, this is obviously what happens here as well, with Adrana being obviously captured by Bousa Sennen in Revenger. So this is not exactly a new way of doing that. Obviously, the Pirates of the Caribbean movies do something similar with, whatever those two guys are called, Will and Elizabeth, I think, sort of being forced to join with Captain Jack Sparrow for whatever reason, all of that stuff, right? So we have that specific element in here as well. And then there's, of course, just, situations where people are forced to change flags or being far out and believing that they are still acting under orders, especially if they are privateers. And then their home countries are obviously, once again, signing a peace treaty, and suddenly it's no longer officially privateering, but illegal piracy. So that is something that also happens, and we can see the whole Bousa Sennen situation happening in that way, shifting between those, right? On the one hand, being officially, hunting a pirate, and then, taking over that pirate and suddenly being seen as the pirates because it was not the official licensed pirate hunting. That is also happening here. And this is something we'll come back to when we talk about, the imperialism and all of that. So that's something I wanted to bring up in the beginning, that historical context, because I think it's, it's a really important element to see how much of, the things that make pirate stories work is sort of tied into historical, or at least into structural elements, and needs to be transported into space if you want to have a space pirate story. Which brings on to another part that, of course, makes pirate stories, and that is seaboard life. We already talked about this a bit last time, how by having sails that use the solar winds for propulsion, Alastair Reynolds gets to do all of the wonderful sail magic, and he goes further with this than a lot of other pirate stories, in having long discussions on vectors, on all of the stuff that makes sailing such an interesting sport if you're interested in sailing, right? So he can do all of that, include having people run around in the rigging. Well, they're using spacesuits and all of that, but having all of that happen in space. Another part is, of course, shipboard life being dreary, food rotting away, those kind of elements obviously happen here as well. We have the situation where Scrambly is wounded, and her leg is obviously infected, and suddenly you need to deal with, wounds and stuff on board of an enclosed ship. All of these elements are in here, and I think these are well done, and having spaceships allows for that. And this, I think, is where the more hard sci-fi element of science fiction kind of often comes in, because life on a spaceship is incredibly cramped, the same way it is incredibly cramped on a sailing vessel in, say, the golden age of piracy. And not only then, for example, another option would be, say, submarines in World War II, and there is an example for that, to port that into space, and that is, of course, by Glenn Cook, Passage at Arms, which is a prequel to his, whatever it's called, is it Starseeder, something like that, trilogy. It's been ages since I read that, but Passage at Arms is basically submarine warfare, but put into space, and it does the same sort of thing that Alastair Reynolds is doing here, and I just wanted to bring up that comparison. You should read Passage at Arms if you haven't yet. It's a really, really good book as well. Anyway, so I wanted to bring those elements up and show how more of the pirate stuff is happening here. Now let's look to the next part, where I think this as a trilogy works really well. We've spoken about this previously, how pirate stories are often very convoluted, because you have all these different tropes and these different elements, these different points you have to hit, right? You have to have your treasures search, you have to have your ghost ship, you have to have your pursuit on, your stern chase, as it is so wonderfully put in sailing terms. You have to have that, but you also have to have your swashbuckling parts. You have to go to a pirate port somewhere, whether it's Tortuga or any other one, doesn't really matter, right? You have to go there, and you have to have your rundown bars, and having to deal with fences and all of that stuff, and having to do some swashbuckling with, chandeliers and all of those things, because all of this is sort of expected. And when you read something like, say, On Stranger Tides, you can tell that the plot is way too meandering, because all of these points have to be hit. The same thing kind of happens up to a point with The Adventures of Amin al-Sirafi, and of course with The Pirates by George MacDonald Fraser, although there it's obviously turned up to 11 because it is satirizing that specific problem as well. Now, Alistair Reynolds, by putting this, turning this into a trilogy, kind of gets away with it in an easier way by having the, revenge plot, finding the pirate ship, facing off against the pirate being the first story. And yes, it also has a treasure search and all of that in there, but it's much more, coherent and sort of like closed off in itself. So now this time around we have the next part where we, for example, have the whole like onshore, the shore leave part happening in the wheel habitat with the stuff where we pick up new crew, new characters and so forth, that also have to deal with the seedy underbelly of any sort of like borderline illegal pirate settlement basically. So by turning it into a trilogy, Alistair Reynolds has the opportunity of turning it into 3 more straightforward narratives that all work and have different focuses, and I think that is to its advantage. The next part that I want to turn to before we move further down like themes is, of course, a narrative choice that Reynolds made here, and I think a wonderful one. See, the first book was obviously told from first-person narrative by Fura Ness, Arafura Ness, and her chase to bring Adrana back and defeat Bowser Sennen. Now this book is told from Adrana's perspective, and her attempts of coming to terms with what she turned into, but also what her sister turned into, and coming to figure these things out. And I think this is a wonderful choice because it allows us to sort of grow both characters, both sisters, as individuals, the way they have sibling rivalry, but also a sibling connection, sibling love, and trying to come to terms with what the universe has done to them. And I think this is one thing that a lot of pirate stories don't necessarily work so well with, and Reynolds found a way of dealing with that. And that is the relation between the hero and the universe. See, pirate stories, by being adventure stories, often have larger-than-life characters, which means that they are often pretty well armored against anything the world can spring at them. You read the adventures of Amina al-Sirafi, and while there is sex and violence, mostly violence in the first one, none of the major crew members ever gets any of that, right? They get wounded, but nothing bad happens there, and their souls are safe, and everything is good. It doesn't actually have much like meaning or impact. And the same goes for On Stranger Tides, where also everything is good, and the main characters remain, well, because except for Captain Davies, of course, who dies, but like most characters have like a lot of immunity in a lot of ways. And once again, this is part of the sort of like pirate narrative. You have these characters that are all sort of larger than life. And Reynolds kind of skirts that by having his characters all survive and be, well, fairly immune when it comes to the physical stuff. But he does very much impact sort of like switch that impact to like the interpersonal relationships, the sister relationship, the trust issues that come with, having people that have gone through like a lot of psychological trauma and are maybe no longer able to trust each other, or trying to protect each other from different kind of dangers and so forth. And he did that in the first book, and he does it in the second book, but by switching the narrator and giving us the other sister's perspective in this one round, it is, I think, more poignant, and it works much better. Because we already know sort of like how Fiora's mind works from the first book, and now we see that from the outside, and have Adrana's perspective on that. And that's something I want to keep an attention on when we talk about the third book, which is, of course, Bone Silence. And just wanted to bring that up because I think it also touches upon another thing, and that is agency and constraint. Because pirate stories are all about agency. Pirates are heroes, right? They have adventures, they act, they do whatever, and the world can't touch them, and they are always willing to turn against the world and have their own will. And that is a fun story, but it's obviously not how the world works. And if you apply sort of like historical context and structures, you know that pirates were heavily constrained by, as I already said, like peace treaties signed in Europe, the economics of having to deal with people to sell stuff to survive. All of these constraints were heavy on pirates in like real history. So what we see in this book is very much sort of this combination of personal agency, and the Ness sisters very actively trying to solve problems, to solve mysteries, to find out what is going on with the coins, what is going on with the occupations, all of that stuff, right? They're trying really hard to do that. But they are constantly faced by the universe trying actively to stop them by, having the Combines follow them and trying to send, people out with a bounty to destroy Bosa Senon or whatever, because they are actively endangering the economic system or the system of exploitation that is going on in this specific solar system. Right, so we have that happening, and we have the Ganvor, or in this case, obviously, Captain Rackamore's brother, who's also a traitor. We have all these external constraints that are in there, and the characters, the sisters, are very much driven by the universe and are constantly trying to sort of claw back some level of agency. And I think that is a very good way of dealing with, realism and still keeping it high adventure and piratey, and that's something I very much admire in this book, in all three books. So that's something I wanted to look at, mention first. And now let's talk about the final part, and that is, of course, the systems, the capitalism, the imperialism, the occupations. See, this was hinted at at the end of the first book. There is something going on with the coins, which may or may not be the souls of aliens. Now, I think that is a very clever metaphor, and we will come back to that in the final book. But the idea that gold is basically, or in this case coins, are taken out of the solar system is a clever world-building choice. See, what happened in the Golden Age of piracy, for example, is of course all the gold being extracted and basically taken out of America by mostly the Spanish at that time and taken to Europe. You have brutal exploitation of a place, and it is taken out of that system that has all kinds of, issues in Europe at the time, but that's what it is. And you have pirates that are sort of like interjecting themselves in there and sometimes working for one party or another. But that process of exploitation, of taking resources out of a place and bringing it somewhere else, is a fundamental thing that makes piracy work. And we have the same setup here, right? We have all the baubles and worlds around the sun, the old and dying sun, and coins are extracted by humans here and then are slowly shipped out of the system by the different alien species who run the Combines. So I think having that sort of idea of imperialism back in the system, in the narrative, is a systemic choice that Alastair Reynolds made, and calling those coins, connecting them to souls, I think, is a very clever metaphor about, capital and capital extraction and so forth that we can come back to, but I don't want to make it all Marxist just yet. I just wanted to bring that specific part up, the same way that, having the different civilizations in that system called occupations is a very deliberate sort of like choice of words, because it is, once again, it's an extractive process. The people in these different baubles and systems are all sort of living at the sufferance of those colonial powers that are from outside the system. I think that's once again a deliberate choice, because it leads to constant sort of like precarity that allows all of these very grey area things to work, like piracy and baubles and treasure hunting and all of that. And we see all of that happening here. And it also means that once the Combines are the big corporations, the capital itself is getting up to swat down someone who is sort of endangering the larger undertaking of capital extraction. That's when things get brutal, and that's how piracy in the Golden Age also kind of ended, is when it became more profitable to stop piracy for the larger system of global capital. That's one way of narrating that, and I think Alastair Reynolds is tackling that sort of through the medium of teenage girl space pirates, which I think is an interesting choice, and one that allows for all these different angles, and maybe allows people to see this that would otherwise maybe not look at those kind of ideas. And that's sort of like I wanted to bring up before we end this today, because we'll talk more about that when we talk about Bone Silence and all of this kind of comes to an end. We certainly have a couple of final sort of like bits and pieces pirate stories. Like we have the Twinklies at the beginning of the story, so we have our zombie pirates, which is a really cool idea to have that sort of like turned into space things, which obviously leaves out all the culturally insensitive ideas of Vaudin and so forth that we've seen in some pirate stories. We have that. We have a massive treasure that is hidden in secret ways with the miser, when we find out near the end of the story that, of course, this is there's something more to this treasure, and it is in fact a cursed treasure because it does something crazy. And that's where we end this, by accidentally bursting a bubble, and it's not a South Sea bubble, but it's certainly a bubble, and destroying the economic system and becoming a much bigger threat to the powers that be. And we'll find out what the Nest Sisters do about that in the final video for Pirate Winter about Bone Silence. And until then, well, I don't know, like, subscribe, comment, tell me what you think. Join the Patreon, join the channel if you feel like it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. And until then, thanks and cheers.